Chapter 24. Victor. Nobody was in his path. He came to a stop with Prince Snow a few feet inside his range.
"What's this about, downgrade?"
"You!" He pointed at Swarm with a construct whip held in his hand. It was very dramatic. Swarm wasn't impressed. "Hand over the bots, now."
"Why? What prompted this? I already told you I can't."
"Don't lie." He dashed forward. "I need them." This desperation was wildly out of character. Even at his angriest during their first two encounters, that had been born out of entitlement, not fear. Something was off. Swarm skated backwards, baiting the prince away from the storefronts and their occupants. Swarm shot across the street, earning a chorus of horns as a car passed between them. A second came close enough for Swarm to feel the wind it generated. He dodged, but a normal person on skates would have been hit.
"Tell me what's going on,"
he shouted at his pursuer once he was in the trees. They'd give him a set of obstacles to duck around and for the whip to get caught on. "I'm going to be murdered," Prince Snow shouted back. "Just give me the tech."
"No, I don't know how to get it off, and you hurt people."
Swarm switched to sneakers. Skates were no good on grass. He lost a little distance during the footwear change, but he was well into the trees by the time the prince crossed the road. That didn't stop him from cracking the whip at him, but Swarm caught what strikes the trees didn't get on his javelin or armored forearms. The armor absorbed blows perfectly. Swarm appreciated it all the more when he saw how the lashes that caught trees stripped bark. Swarm was hard-pressed to keep the whip from tearing into his less protected neck. Instead of heading straight back, Swarm took an arcing path towards the fountain in the center of the square. It was a two-tiered marble structure 3 times Swarm's height, consisting of a pair of bowls that spilled into a large, shallow pool. The pool was lined with a ridge that was the perfect height to sit on. Sana had always wanted to splash around in the water when she was younger. Swarm jumped onto the ridge and launched himself backwards into the pool. He landed with a tremendous splash and dashed for the center, never turning his back on Prince Snow. The water lapped at his calves and dragged against him. The prince jumped onto the ridge and cracked his whip. It hit Swarm's chest, but his armor absorbed the blow, and he didn't feel worse than a tingle. He turned on his heel, stabbed his javelin into the stone, and vaulted up to the first tier of the fountain. The push gave him just enough height to catch the lip of the larger bowl with his chest. He swung his legs up and rolled into the basin, getting soaked in the process. Prince Snow's whip cracked against his ankle as he did. It tore into Swarm's skin with a stinging pain, right below where the suit ended. Swarm hissed and rubbed the bloody welt once he was shielded by the fountain's stone. The large bowl felt sturdy enough, but Swarm didn't trust the smaller one to hold his weight, even though the greater height of the smaller bowl would offer an advantage. Position decided, he disintegrated the javelin, which he dropped in his scramble for higher ground. Within the span of a few seconds after that, he created a pair of more suitable constructs, popped up to a kneeling position, and threw them at Prince Snow. The first hiking boot collided with the hand holding the whip, sending both tools flying. Swarm dissolved and recalled the shoe before it could hit the water, but the whip sank with a plop. Prince Snow didn't notice, as the second boot had hit him in the face and sent him falling on his rear. He sat up, but didn't stand. His wet clothes, irritated expression, and the hair in his face gave him a strong resemblance to a cat in a bath. "Why are you like this?" he demanded. Swarm crossed his arms.
"I was minding my own business before you showed up and started screaming. Now we're both uncomfortable. Congratulations."
He growled and threw a construct ball. Swarm dodged it and rolled his eyes.
"Real mature. Now that you've had a chance to cool your jets, slow down and tell me what's got your knickers in a twist. I can't help you if I don't know what's wrong."
"You help me?" he snorted. "Like you would." He ran forward and made a pulling motion. The ball from earlier clocked Swarm in the back of his head. It sent him pitching forward, almost tumbling off the bowl. In revenge, Swarm sent a bot cluster to him and formed a scarf in front of his face. It blinded him. He stopped running to claw it off. Swarm took the pause to speak.
"Don't bet on that. Bet on me wanting to help you but valuing the lives of bystanders more. I don't see any bystanders nearby, so let me help you. Talk."
He yanked the scarf off and threw it to the side. He covered his mouth with the back of his hand and looked down. His shoulders were trembling. Swarm reached for him despite knowing the gesture would be useless, but then he threw back his head and laughed. It was the kind of full-bodied laugh that followed an excellent joke, and it went on for a good 10 seconds. After it tapered off, he wiped the corner of his eye. "Oh no. Unless you're willing to give up the secret behind Lord Static's cybercrimes, you can't help me."
"Cybercrimes?"
It didn't make sense.
How do cybercrimes come into this? Lord Static robbed banks and stole things like tech and artifacts.
You don't know? His confusion seemed genuine, but didn't last long. He shook his head and flicked his wrists. Doesn't matter, you're involved. For what it's worth, I would have given you more time if I had the choice. He made a simple gesture with both hands, dodging the shoe Swarm chucked at him. A portion of his bots turned into a shield. It resembled a larger version of the shields he'd used during their second fight. He maneuvered it up and angled it forward to protect himself from further projectiles. He hadn't planned on Swarm's reckless streak. With a battle cry that sounded like a blender being tortured, Swarm launched himself off of his perch and landed feet first on the shield. The angle wouldn't make Swarm fall off, so he shoved off and somersaulted, landing on his feet with his back to the fountain's main structure. Water splashed. A second after takeoff, a field of spikes burst from the surface of the shield. Swarm took a moment to be grateful for his boosted proprioception. He'd have landed flat on his face or been impaled otherwise. As it was, the worst that happened was a twinging in his calves. He held his arms straight out in front of him and summoned a javelin. He charged. Prince Snow swung his shield in front of him, but Swarm swerved. Before the prince could react, Swarm thrust the javelin into the space in front of his neck. He clotheslined the prince and pulled him in. They wound up with Swarm's elbows hooked around the javelin, the back of Prince Snow's skull braced against Swarm's sternum, and the javelin's shaft digging into the soft spot where the bottom of Prince Snow's jaw met his throat. Unfortunately, Prince Snow's hands were still free. He swung his arms up and the shield went flying toward Swarm's face. He ducked, but the movement broke the arch in Prince Snow's back. He got his feet under him, grabbed Swarm's arms in a bruising grip, and yanked him over his shoulder. Swarm yelped. The world went topsy-turvy, then blurry as his head went underwater. Prince Snow pinned him down. The water thrummed with the vibrations of their bots. The air filter in his mask kept the water at bay, but Swarm could already feel the dampness soaking through. He had a few seconds before he started to drown in earnest. He took a deep, damp breath before the first few drops hit his face. The water was cold, in awful contrast to Prince Snow's burning hands on his forehead and chest. Swarm thrashed and bucked, but the prince was heavy and strong. There was a reason Sana's dad had emphasized not getting grabbed during their training. Whoever separated wrestlers by weight class knew what they were doing. Black spots danced behind Swarm's eyes as the seconds ticked down. His flailing arms grew heavy, and the demand for oxygen rose. His lungs burned. In the last seconds before he would black out, a blurry memory surfaced. He'd been pinned like this before, and he'd gotten out then. A scarf formed around Prince Snow's neck with its ends in Swarm's hands. He pulled it taut with the last of his strength. Prince Snow's hands disappeared, and Swarm let one of the scarf ends go. He drove his fist into the side of the prince's abdomen, and the weight above him swayed. He bucked his hips, and it vanished entirely. He surfaced. Thank God. He tried to gulp for air, only to get a mouthful of water. The filter! He yanked up his mask and threw the device out of the fountain, then took a breath of blessed, warm air. Prince Snow was right next to him, hands clawing at the scarf. Swarm dissolved it and, in a moment of pure childish spite, pinched the prince's nose and used it to jerk his head around. He flailed, and Swarm pushed his face so he fell back into the water. He surfaced spluttering. Both supers got to their feet. Swarm rolled his mask down, dismissed his dropped javelin, and summoned a scarf in a lasso shape. Prince Snow made a gesture that Swarm knew created a broadsword, but his hand spasmed. Swarm threw the scarf around his raised wrist and dragged the limb forward. It knocked the prince off balance. Swarm grabbed the prince's gauntlet, but received a shove that knocked him back. He had to let the scarf go when the prince threw his trapped arm up, or else he'd have been dragged off his feet. Prince Snow fixed the gauntlet Swarm had loosened and fixed his enemy with a hateful glare. Swarm grinned. Plan set. Prince Snow drew a dagger from his sleeve and slashed at Swarm's chest. It scraped across the armor covering Swarm's pecs with a horrible noise, but no pain. Swarm got in close and jabbed the prince's kidney. He gasped in pain, and Swarm clocked him under the chin. He staggered back. Swarm body-checked him. He went down. His head was underwater. Swarm straddled his chest and wrenched the knife out of his grip, only for a second knife to come at his neck from the other side. Swarm parried the blow. He wouldn't be making the same mistake a second time. Prince Snow thrashed and bucked, nearly knocking Swarm into his blade. Swarm grabbed his wrist again and whacked the back of the prince's hand with the butt of his stolen knife. The hand spasmed, dropping its weapon. Swarm threw his own away. It landed outside the fountain. and tore the prince's gauntlet off with both hands. The force stabilized him enough for Prince Snow to sit up and shove him off. That was fine by Swarm. He had what he wanted. He scrambled up and made for the edge of the fountain. The water soaking his armor and dragging at his feet made running hard, but the prince was still recovering from his near drowning and had delayed to retrieve yet another knife, this time from his boot. He lagged well behind. Swarm leapt over the rim of the fountain, landed on skates, and made for the road. He clutched the gauntlet to his chest. If he was right, the prince was currently defanged. All Swarm had to do was keep the gauntlet away from him until he could tie him up. He checked behind himself and saw Prince Snow hot on his heels. He was wearing an expression of pure fury and had the knife in a ready position. Joy. Swarm sped up. Once he was in the middle of the street, he turned and sent a cloud of bots off to either side of himself, low to the ground. Prince Snow didn't notice. Tunnel vision. Swarm stood his ground and held the gauntlet out. A little further. A little further. The clouds arced around and engulfed his legs. He looked down too late to stop himself. A scarf formed around his ankles, and he fell on his face. Swarm pounced on him. He was disarmed, and his arms were bound behind his back with another scarf in seconds. To be safe, Swarm wrestled the second gauntlet off as well. Once it was in Swarm's hand, his bots condensed into a ball the size of a honeydew. Swarm picked the smooth, oddly heavy construct up and cradled it in one arm. By the time the police approached, Swarm was straddling Prince Snow's back and pinning him with his free hand on the nape of his neck. He was wriggling and cursing, but couldn't do much more than flop around. Detective Valentin was the one to do the honor of handcuffing him, and he and Detective Archer pulled the prince to his feet. He didn't resist, even after Swarm retrieved his scarves. He just stood there, head down, chuckling bitterly. Swarm had to say something.
I'll take care of these. They'll be intact when you get out, even if I won't give them back to you.
He shook his head and looked Swarm in the eye. He noticed the color, a dark brown, for the first time. The moment felt intimate, even with the detectives inches away and the rest of the officers circling the square. He said, "I'm not getting out. Congratulations. You've killed me. You win."
What are you talking about?
Swarm clutched the white bots closer to his chest and took a step back.
You'll be fine. It's jail, not death row. And a secret identity isn't a life. The you with a real identity is gonna be alright, even if you can't be a supervillain anymore.
Stop talking, Detective Valentin grunted. He and Detective Archer tried to pull the prince away. Lord Static's offshoots ignored him. Prince Snow dug in his heels. Lord Static's killer is still out there, the one who summons monsters. Did you forget? The blood drained from his face. He hadn't, but the prince had been his priority.
You saw them?
She gave me a week to join her group and hand over the secret behind the Lord's cybercrimes. I'm not going to be able to do that from jail, but I have no doubt she'll be able to kill me while I'm locked up. He offered a bitter smile. Be safe, Swarm. You're the last of us. Might even be the best someday. Okay, that's enough, Detective Archer declared. He and Detective Valentin managed to half-drag, half-carry Prince Snow away. Detective Valentin started reciting the Miranda rights as they left. Swarm retreated to the fountain, retrieved his air filter, and collapsed on the edge. He refused to let go of the prince's bots and gauntlets. The fight was over. It didn't feel like a victory.